The year is 1887. The Wyoming air carried a scent that was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the dust from the parched earth or the smoke from the branding fires, not just the smell of pine from the half-built structures that dotted the sprawling ranch. It was something older, a deep-seated tension that had seeped into the very soil. The ranchers, known for their grit, had driven a herd of cattle into this remote valley 3 days prior. Their horses had left deep impressions in the sun-baked ground. Alastair Finch stood outside his modest cabin, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the jagged peaks, casting the landscape in hues of deep purple and shadowy grey. He was 35 years old, a man who had left a quiet life in Missouri for the untamed West, seeking fortune but finding mostly hardship. He had witnessed stampedes, faced down rustlers, and seen the unforgiving side of nature. But he had never encountered a situation like this. Behind a makeshift enclosure, originally intended for stray calves, huddled 15 young Chinese women. Their attire was a strange mix of practical and out-of-place, simple cotton trousers and tunics, some threadbare, others surprisingly new, but all covered in a fine layer of dust from their journey. Their eyes, however, conveyed the true gravity of their situation, guarded, weary, and devoid of any expectation of kindness. News had traveled through the sparse settlements and ranches with the speed of a prairie fire, fueled by suspicion and ignorance. "They're prostitutes," a ranch hand had whispered near the cook fire, the word laced with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Brought in for the railroad cruise," another had added, his voice low. A younger hand, barely a man, had spat on the ground and muttered, "Shouldn't be here." Alastair remained silent. He had learned early on that the harshness of the frontier often turned men into purveyors of half-truths and outright lies, their stories shaped by fear and prejudice. The ranch owner, a distant man of wealth named Mr. Thompson, had sent a telegraph. His instructions were terse and devoid of empathy. "Finch, you are responsible for the cargo. We don't know their origins for certain. Could be stolen property, could be carrying disease. Keep them isolated until the agent from Cheyenne arrives to claim them." Alastair had nodded, his jaw tight. "And Finch," the telegraph had continued, "keep things orderly. No trouble. We're respectable cattlemen, not slavers. Remember that." "Understood," Alastair had wired back. But as he walked toward the enclosure, he wondered if the women inside knew the difference. The man tasked with translation was a young cook named Charlie, who had spent time in San Francisco and picked up a pidgin form of Cantonese. He was a lanky youth of 20, more comfortable with a skillet than with words, his face a constant mask of unease. Charlie stood beside Alastair as they approached the enclosure. The evening breeze rustled the canvas shelter they had erected, making a sound like a dry whisper. "You ready for this?" Alastair asked, his voice low. Charlie swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I've translated for merchants, for railroad foremen, but this—" "I don't know what to call them, people," Alastair said quietly. "Start there." They stepped inside the enclosure. The silence was heavy, thick with fear and mistrust. 15 pairs of eyes fixed on them. Some of the women sat on the hard-packed earth, while others stood clustered together, their arms crossed protectively. A few were weeping silently, their faces streaked with grime. Then, one woman stepped forward. She was small in stature, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a mixture of defiance and desperation. Her voice, when she spoke in broken English, was sharp and clear. "We won't undress." The words hung in the charged air, a stark accusation. Alastair froze. Charlie's mouth fell open, but no words came out. The other women began to murmur, their voices a low hum of fear, some pulling their simple garments tighter around themselves. One young woman sank to her knees, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Alastair slowly raised his hands, his palms open in a gesture of peace. "Nobody is asking you to," but the woman, whose name he would later learn was Mai, did not believe him. Why should she? Men in this new, strange land had only brought her and the others hardship and suffering. Why would these men be any different? She took a step back, her body trembling, her fists clenched. "We won't," she repeated, her voice rising. "You cannot make us." Alastair's jaw tightened. He turned to the 2 ranch hands who stood a few paces behind him. Everyone out. Now but foreman, we're supposed to, one of them began. Out, Alistair repeated, his voice firm. The men hesitated, then turned and left, leaving only Charlie with him. Alistair picked up a discarded wooden crate and sat down, deliberately making himself seem smaller, less of a threat. He motioned for Charlie to kneel beside him. Tell her, Alistair said softly, that no one here is going to harm her. Tell her we're not like the men who brought her here. Tell her. Tell her she is safe now, Charlie translated, his voice faltering at first, then growing steadier. Mai stared at them, her breathing shallow and rapid. Then, slowly, she sank onto the ground across from them. You lie, she whispered in her native tongue. Charlie shook his head. No, he's telling the truth, men always lie. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Then, Mai began to speak. Her story emerged in fragments, a tapestry of broken sentences and long, heavy pauses. She and the others had been promised good jobs in America, some as seamstresses, others as servants for wealthy families. The promises had been lies. They had been brought over in the dark holds of ships, their documents taken, their freedom stolen. They were moved from one rough settlement to another, intended for the brothels that catered to miners and laborers. But when the law had started to crack down in the last town, the men who had owned them had abandoned them, leaving them to be found by the ranchers. They told us, Mai said, her voice barely a whisper, that the ranchers would be worse, that you would use us and then leave us to die in the wilderness. A cold weight settled in Alistair's gut. It wasn't anger, not pity, but something heavier, responsibility. He stood up slowly, Charlie following his lead. Tell her, Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion, that I'm going to get them food, fresh water, and blankets. And tell her that no one, is going to lay a hand on them. For Charlie translated. Mai's eyes welled with tears, but she held his gaze. Why? She asked in English. Why you help? Alistair looked at her, at all the frightened faces around her. He said the only thing that felt true. Because it's the right thing to do. But the real truth, the full story of who these women were and the powerful men who had brought them here, was still a hidden, dangerous secret, buried in the ledgers of a trading company in Cheyenne. And when that truth finally came to light, everything would change. That afternoon, Alistair returned to the enclosure. This time, he brought with him not armed men, but the ranch's cook, a grizzled old man named Silas who had a gentle touch with injured animals, and a young hand named Ben, who was barely out of his teens. The women flinched as the men entered. Mai immediately stood, placing herself between the newcomers and the other women, her posture a silent, defiant no. Tell them, Alistair said to Charlie, that Silas and Ben are here to help. They need to check for injuries, sickness, lack of food. He paused, looking directly at Mai. They will remain fully clothed. We will work around it. Charlie translated, and a hush fell over the enclosure. Silas looked at Alistair, his brow furrowed. Foreman, how are we supposed to? You'll figure it out, Alistair said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Treat them like people first, and tend to their needs second. Ben nodded slowly. Understood, sir. For the next hour, Silas and Ben moved through the enclosure with a quiet, deliberate respect. They checked for fever by placing a hand on a forehead. They looked at arms and ankles for signs of injury, offering salves and clean bandages. They spoke in low, soothing tones, even though the women couldn't understand their words. At first, the women were tense, waiting for the kindness to curdle into cruelty. But it never did. Ben knelt beside a young woman, no older than 16, who had a nasty cut on her leg. He cleaned it gently, his hand steady, his voice calm. You're going to be all right, he said, his words a balm even in an unknown tongue. You're safe now. When Silas and Ben finally left, they had taken nothing from the women. Not their dignity, not their hope, not the fragile beginnings of trust. Instead, they left behind blankets, hot broth in tin cups, a sack of biscuits, and tucked into a corner, a small bag of dried apples. One of the younger women picked up a piece of dried apple as if it were a precious jewel. She tasted it, and then began to cry, not from sorrow, but from a relief so profound it was painful. Mai sat on a crate, staring at the items, her hands finally still. Charlie stood near the entrance, watching her. "You still think we're lying?" Mai didn't answer, but for the first time, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in her eyes. That night, Alistair couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch of his cabin, the smoke from his cigarette curling into the cold, clear air, the stars watching with a silent indifference. Mr. Thompson's telegraph from earlier in the day lay on the table beside him. Headquarters wants a full report by morning. Names, origins, their legal status. They're worried about the tongs. Alistair had muttered to himself. He knew the term from his time in San Francisco, the secret societies that often controlled criminal enterprises. "Sir, these women are not criminals." "They're—" "I know," the return telegraph had read. "But until we can prove that, they are to be treated as property, held in custody for how long?" Alistair had wired back. The answer had been chilling in its vagueness. "As long as it takes." The next morning, Alistair made a decision that had nothing to do with orders from a distant owner. He found a broken-down buckboard wagon behind one of the barns. The wheels were wobbly, and the wood was splintered, but it was serviceable. In the back of the wagon, he placed a large, heavy object covered in a dusty canvas. It was an old sewing machine, the kind operated with a foot pedal, sturdy and built to last. He had traded a bottle of whiskey for it with a traveling merchant months ago, thinking one of the ranch hands' wives might have a use for it. He pulled the wagon to the enclosure and carried the sewing machine inside. The women stared at him as if he had brought them a strange, incomprehensible gift. "It works," Alistair said through Charlie. "I checked it. If you want to mend your clothes, or make new ones, you can." Mai stood up slowly. She walked over to the machine, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on its black iron body. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Because," Alistair said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name, "you deserve to feel like people again." Over the next 3 days, a quiet transformation took place. The women began to sew. They mended their torn clothing, stitched patches onto worn-out trousers, and took scraps of canvas and old flour sacks and began to fashion new garments. Mai worked tirelessly, her hands moving with a practiced skill that spoke of a life before this one, a life of quiet domesticity now lost to her. She made herself a simple, clean blouse from a bolt of muslin Alistair had found in the supply shed. When she finished, she held it up, the plain fabric seeming to glow in the dim light of the enclosure. Charlie was there, bringing a basket of potatoes. He saw the blouse and smiled. "It's beautiful." Mai looked at him, her voice steady for the first time since he had met her. "If I wear this when I leave here, it will mean I am clean again." Charlie didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. But a storm was gathering. 2 days later, a wagon arrived from Cheyenne, carrying 2 deputies and a man who introduced himself as an agent of the territorial governor, a man named Whitaker. He was thin and sharp-eyed, a man who saw the world in black and white, in assets and liabilities. He demanded to inspect the property. Alistair stood outside the enclosure as Whitaker strode inside, with Charlie at his side to translate. The women froze. Whitaker looked at them with the detached air of a man inspecting livestock. "These are the ones." "They're victims, sir," Alistair said, his voice low and tight. Whitaker didn't even look at him. "Until their status is legally determined, they are unclaimed property." "Understood." "Sir, with all due respect." "Understood, Foreman." Alistair's jaw clenched. "Yes, sir." Whitaker turned to the deputies. "Prepare them for transport. They'll be moved to a holding facility in Cheyenne until the word, spoken in a clear, strong voice, came from Mai. She stood in the center of the enclosure, her new blouse clutched in her hands, her eyes blazing. "No more cages," she said in broken English. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Foreman, control your property." But Alistair didn't move. In that moment, he realized something that would alter the course of the next 72 hours. He was not going to let them take these women. Not to another holding pen, not to another cage, not to disappear into the brutal machinery of a system that saw them as less than human. Charlie saw the look on his face. "Foreman, what are you thinking?" Alistair's voice was quiet, steady, and dangerous. "I'm thinking," he said, "that some orders aren't meant to be followed, and that's when everything changed." Because miles away, in a dusty office in Cheyenne, a clerk was about to file a set of papers that would expose the truth about these 15 women. The truth was about to be unleashed, and Foreman Alistair Finch was about to make the most dangerous decision of his life. The clerk in Cheyenne was a young man named Morris, with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually worried expression. He had been tasked with cataloging the assets of a recently bankrupt trading company. He had seen ledgers for cattle, for land, for mining equipment. But the documents he found in a locked file cabinet made his hands tremble. He opened the cabinet at 8 a.m. on April 22nd. By 8:15, he was running to find the U.S. Marshal. Back at the ranch, Alistair sat in the cookhouse with Charlie, drinking coffee that tasted like ash. Whitaker and his deputies had been ordered to wait 24 hours before transporting the women, something about a delay in the paperwork. But Alistair knew it was only a temporary reprieve. "You're really going to do this?" Charlie asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Do what?" "Don't play dumb, Foreman. I've seen that look in your eyes before." "You're planning something," Alistair didn't answer. He just stared into his coffee cup as if it held the future. The truth was, he didn't have a plan, not a real one. All he had was a conviction, a deep-seated certainty that if those women were loaded onto that wagon tomorrow morning, he would never forgive himself. "Charlie," he said finally, "you ever do something you knew was wrong by the law, but right by everything else that matters?" Charlie leaned back, his young face etched with a gravity beyond his years. "My family came over from Ireland during the famine, Foreman. I've heard stories my whole life about what happens when good people follow bad laws." He paused. "Yeah, I know what it's like when the law doesn't make sense anymore." Alistair nodded slowly. Then the cookhouse door swung open. A rider, his horse lathered in sweat, stood there, holding a telegram. He handed it to Alistair. It was from the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. They spread the documents Morris had found across a rough-hewn table in Alistair's cabin. The Marshal had sent copies with the rider. As Alistair read, his face grew grim. "These aren't just prostitutes brought over by the tongs," he said, his voice low. "At least, not all of them." "What do you mean?" Charlie asked, leaning closer. "I mean, they were lied to, tricked. The trading company kept meticulous records. Look." Alistair pointed to a line in the ledger. "My, age 24, from a village in Guangdong province. Her family was told she would be a seamstress in San Francisco. They were paid a small sum. The company called it an advance on her wages. It was a slave contract," Charlie said, his voice filled with disgust. Alistair nodded. He read through more of the names. Lee, French-trained, a lady's maid, promised a position with a wealthy family in Denver. Celine, her father was a farmer who owed a debt to the company he couldn't finish. The cabin was silent, the air thick with the weight of the injustice they had uncovered. "How many?" Charlie asked. "At least 10 of the 15, Alistair said, rubbing his tired eyes. "The others are harder to say. Their records are less clear. But it seems they were all brought over under false pretenses. So they're not just unclaimed property," Charlie said, the words heavy with sarcasm. "They're victims of a crime, a federal crime," Alistair said. "This changes everything. These women are victims of human trafficking. They should be." The cabin door opened again. Agent Whitaker stepped inside, his face a mask of cold fury. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've been informed there's been a development, sir. We've just discovered," Alistair began. "I've read the Marshal's summary," Whitaker cut him off. "And I'm ordering an immediate security review. Until we can verify every one of these women's identities, confirm they're not part of some larger criminal conspiracy, they remain in custody, sir," Alistair said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "These women are not criminals. They're victims." Whitaker turned to him, his eyes like chips of ice. Foreman, are you a federal agent? No, sir. Are you trained in interstate criminal investigations? No, sir. Then I suggest you leave the analysis to those who are, Whitaker said, his voice flat and hard. The transport proceeds as scheduled. Tomorrow at dawn. They'll be moved to a federal facility in Cheyenne for interrogation and verification. Alastair's fists clenched at his sides. How long will that take? Weeks. Maybe months. These things require thoroughness. Months. Charlie's voice cracked. Sir, some of these women have been held against their will for over a year. They've been— That's enough, young man, Whitaker snapped. The West is an ugly place. Verification is necessary. I won't risk a larger incident because we got sentimental over a few. Say it, Alastair interrupted. Everyone turned to look at him. Say what you were about to say, sir, Alastair continued, his voice low and dangerous. Finish that sentence. Whitaker stared at him, his face a mixture of shock and rage. You're dismissed, Foreman. Say it. I said you're dismissed. Alastair held his ground for a long, tense moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more defiance than respect, turned on his heel and walked out. But everyone in that cabin knew what had just happened. A line had been drawn in the dust, and Foreman Alastair Finch had just chosen his side. That night, Alastair found Charlie near the women's enclosure. A storm was rolling in, the sky a bruised purple, the air thick with the smell of rain. I need your help, Alastair said quietly. Charlie looked at him, his young face illuminated by a flash of distant lightning. This is about tomorrow, isn't it? Yeah, you're going to get yourself fired. Or worse, probably. Charlie was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the rising wind. Then he said, What do you need? Inside the enclosure, Mai sat on a crate, holding the clean blouse she had made. She had heard the raised voices, seen the anger on Whitaker's face, felt the tension in the air like a coiled snake. One of the younger women, Sulin, whispered in their dialect, They're going to move us again, aren't they? Mai didn't answer. She just folded the blouse carefully and placed it in a small cloth bag she had sewn. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and in the cookhouse, Foreman Alastair Finch sat across from Charlie and quietly laid out a plan that would either save 15 lives or destroy his own. We've got until dawn, Alastair said. Here's what we're going to do. But what Alastair didn't know, what no one in that remote valley knew, was that two things were about to happen at once. First, a second, more urgent telegram was on its way from the U.S. Marshal, a message that would change the entire situation. And second, Mai and the other women were making their own plan. Because victims of the harsh frontier learn one lesson faster than any other: if you want to survive, you can't wait for someone else to save you. You save yourself. The clock was ticking. Dawn was 6 hours away. And the choice between duty and conscience was about to collide with a force that would echo through the vast, empty spaces of the West. At 2 a.m., the rain had stopped, but the ground was a sea of mud, slick and treacherous. Alastair stood in the shadows near the corral, watching two horses, saddled and ready, stand quietly in the darkness. Charlie was already in the saddle of the first horse. Ben, the young ranch hand, sat astride the second, his face pale but resolute. You don't have to do this, Alastair had told them an hour earlier. Ben had just shaken his head. My mother came over from Scotland with nothing, Foreman. If this had happened to her, I'd hope someone would do the right thing. Charlie hadn't said anything. He had just nodded. Now, in the cold, wet darkness, Alastair checked his pocket watch. The deputies guarding the enclosure would be making their rounds in 10 minutes. He moved quickly and silently toward the enclosure, his boots sinking into the mud. But when he lifted the canvas flap, he froze. The enclosure was empty. Not just empty, but stripped. The blankets were gone. The sewing machine was gone. The crates they had used as seats were gone. And in the center of the enclosure, drawn in the mud with a stick, was a single word in English: "Thank you." Alastair's heart pounded in his chest. Charlie appeared at his side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Foreman, the fence, the back section, it's been taken down." They ran to the back of the enclosure. Sure enough, a section of the rough-hewn fence had been carefully dismantled, the rails lifted from their posts. Not broken, but methodically taken apart. On the ground lay a small, discarded pry bar from the tool shed. The same shed Alistair had visited yesterday to get the sewing machine. "They took it," Charlie whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "The pry bar." While we were planning to save them, they were planning to save themselves. Alistair stared at the gap in the fence. Then, in spite of the danger, in spite of everything, he felt a surge of pride. "Smart," he muttered. "Damn smart. What do we do now?" Charlie asked. Alistair looked at the gap in the fence, then at the horses, standing ready in the darkness. He looked at his watch. 3 minutes until the deputies made their rounds. He made his decision. "We do exactly what we planned," Alistair said. "We take these horses. We ride toward the North Trail." And if anyone asks, he met Charlie's eyes, his own glinting in the faint moonlight. "We were following orders to search for escaped property." Charlie understood immediately. "We give them a head start exactly, and if we don't find them..." Alistair allowed himself a grim smile. "Then I guess they got away." At 3 a.m., 3 riders left the ranch and headed north, their progress slow and deliberate in the muddy terrain. They searched empty ravines and dense thickets of pine. They found nothing. At 6 a.m., just as the sun was beginning to rise, they returned to the ranch and reported that the property had vanished sometime during the storm. A thorough search had revealed no trace. Agent Whitaker was apoplectic. "How does an entire group of women just disappear from a guarded enclosure?" he roared. Alistair stood before him, his face a mask of weary duty. "The storm was bad, sir. They must have used it as cover. The fence was dismantled quietly." "I want every man on this ranch questioned." "Yes, sir, but the questioning led nowhere. The deputies had seen nothing, heard nothing. The fence had been taken apart with a quiet efficiency that spoke of desperation and intelligence." The rider with the second telegram arrived an hour later. It was from the U.S. Marshal, and it was addressed to Agent Whitaker. The Marshal's words were blunt and to the point. The trading company was under federal investigation for slavery and human trafficking. The women were not to be considered property or prisoners, but material witnesses in a federal case. They were to be treated with care and brought to Cheyenne under federal protection, not as prisoners, but as free women. The silence in Alistair's cabin was thick with unspoken recriminations. Whitaker's face was a mottled red. He stared at Alistair, then at the telegram, then back at Alistair, his eyes filled with a furious, impotent rage. Finally, he spoke through clenched teeth. "File a report. Notify the Marshal's office. If these women are found, they are to be offered federal protection." "Yes, sir," Alistair said, his face impassive. Whitaker left without another word, his grand authority crumbled to dust. Alistair Finch returned to his life as a ranch foreman, the quiet hero of a story that was never officially told. He never spoke of it, but every year, on a clear spring night, he would ride out to the North Trail and look up at the vast, star-filled sky. He kept a small, intricately carved wooden button he had found in the mud near the dismantled fence the morning after the women had disappeared. It was a small, simple thing, but to him, it was a symbol of their quiet, determined courage. The truth of where the 15 women went vanished into the vast, unforgiving landscape. Their story became a whisper on the wind, a testament to fear that turned into trust, of victims who became their own saviors. It was a story of a lone rancher who chose humanity over orders, and of a group of women who, when given a moment of dignity and a single tool of liberation, found the strength to carve out their own freedom. The world had tried to erase them, but they had refused to be erased.